I never thought shoveling snow would turn into a full-blown war, but that's a different story for a different time. This one is about something much older, taller, and, in the end, far more satisfying. My name is Sam, and I own a small engine repair shop on the same plot of land my grandfather bought back in the 40s. It's not a fancy place, just a couple of acres on the edge of what used to be farmland and is now generously called Oak Creek Estates. My house is a simple, sturdy ranch my granddad built, and my workshop is a large, metal-sided barn he put up a decade later. For most of my life, this place was just home. A quiet corner of the county where neighbors knew each other, helped each other, and most importantly, left each other alone. The property has one feature that makes it unique. Standing about 100 yards from the house is an old air motor windmill. It's a classic, the kind you see in old westerns, with a steel lattice tower and a big fan of blades that used to creak and groan as they pumped water for the livestock my grandfather raised. The well it once served has been capped for 50 years, and the pump rod was disconnected long before I was born, but the windmill itself remains. My father kept it maintained as a landmark, and I continued the tradition. It was a beautiful piece of history, a silent monument to a time before the county power grid reached this far out. On windy days, the blades still spun, a quiet, rhythmic whirring that was as much a part of this land as the oak trees that gave our community its name. Oak Creek Estates wasn't a modern, planned subdivision with curving streets and identical houses. It was an assortment of older homes on generous lots that had, over time, been loosely organized under a homeowners association. For years, the HOA was a joke. It was started in the 80s to manage the upkeep of the one gravel road that serviced the back half of the properties, and to mow the small patch of green by the entrance that we called a park. The president was usually whichever poor soul didn't step back fast enough at the annual meeting. Dues were $50 a year, and the biggest controversy we ever had was a heated debate in 1997 about whether to plant petunias or geraniums in the community flower bed. That all changed the year Carol Sterling moved in. She bought the old Miller place, tore down the perfectly good farmhouse, and built a massive beige stucco box that looked completely out of place among the older brick ranches and clapboard homes. She came from the city, a fact she mentioned in nearly every conversation, and she brought with her an unshakable conviction that our quiet, rural way of life was fundamentally incorrect and in desperate need of her guidance. She was a woman who seemed fueled by a potent combination of boredom and an unearned sense of superiority. Within 6 months, she had attended her first HOA meeting. Within 7, she had convinced everyone that the association needed a firmer hand and a more ambitious vision. She ran for president unopposed because the rest of us just saw it as a thankless job we didn't want. We had no idea we were handing a scepter to a petty tyrant. Carol's vision, it turned out, was one of oppressive uniformity. She saw our neighborhood not as a collection of individual homes, but as a single, cohesive product whose value needed to be maximized. The changes started small. An email went out, composed in a font so florid it was hard to read, announcing a new bylaw. All mailboxes were to be replaced with a specific board-approved model, a black, powder-coated pedestal unit that cost $200. There was grumbling, but most people, myself included, figured it was easier to just buy the mailbox than to fight it. We were a community of practical people, and this seemed like an eccentric but ultimately harmless request. Then came the rule about trash cans. They could not be visible from the street, except between 6 a.m. on collection day and 8 p.m. that same evening. Violators would receive a written warning, followed by a $25 fine. This was more annoying. My driveway is nearly a quarter-mile long. Hauling the cans up and back on a tight schedule was a chore. A few people got fined, paid it with a sigh, and built little wooden screens to hide their garbage bins. We were still in the appeasement phase. Next, she targeted lawn ornaments. Gnomes were banned outright. Pink flamingos were, in her words, an affront to aesthetic decency. Wind chimes were restricted to 1 per household, with a maximum tube length of 12 inches to preserve auditory tranquility. Each new rule was more specific and more intrusive than the last. Carol, it seemed, was on a mission to scrub every last speck of personality from Oak Creek Estates and replace it with her own beige, sterile ideal. The community's quiet tolerance was beginning to curdle into a low-grade, simmering resentment. We just didn't know what to do about it. The HOA had always been a formality, and none of us knew how to fight a war we didn't even realize we were in until the first shots had already been fired. My war started on a bright, windy Tuesday morning. I was in my workshop, meticulously reassembling the carburetor for a riding mower, when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel of my driveway. That was unusual. Most of my customers called before they came, and friends knew to just come to the shop door. I wiped my hands on a rag and peered out the window. It was a pearl-white Lexus, a car as out of place here as a tuxedo at a barn dance. Carol Sterling emerged from the driver's side, holding a clipboard like a shield. She wasn't dressed for a friendly chat. She was wearing what I privately called her official business pantsuit. I met her on the concrete apron in front of the shop. The spring wind was making a good show of itself, and over her shoulder, I could see the blades of the old windmill spinning lazily against the blue sky. It was a perfect day, and her presence felt like a storm cloud on the horizon. "Samuel," she said, not using my name so much as pronouncing a verdict. She never called me Sam. "We need to discuss an issue of non-compliance." I leaned against the doorframe of my shop, crossing my arms. "Carol, what can I do for you?" She gestured with her clipboard toward the windmill. Her expression was one of profound distaste, as if she were looking at a pile of rotting garbage. "That," she said, her voice tight with authority. "That structure is in violation of the Oak Creek Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions." I admit, I almost laughed. I thought she was joking. "The windmill? Carol, that thing has been standing there since before my father was born. It was here before half the houses in this neighborhood were built. It was here before there was an Oak Creek Estates." "That is irrelevant," she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "As per Article 4, Section 8B of the newly amended bylaws, all auxiliary structures must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Furthermore, as per Section 9C, any structure deemed to be in a state of disrepair or not in aesthetic harmony with the community must be removed at the owner's expense." I stared at her, my amusement fading and being replaced by a slow-burning disbelief. "Architectural Review Committee? That's you, your friend Brenda, and that fellow from the corner house who agrees with everything you say. And aesthetic harmony? You built a beige box that looks like a dental office. This windmill is part of the history of this place." "It is an eyesore," she declared, her voice rising. "It's a rusty, dilapidated piece of industrial junk. It lowers property values. It's a blight on the visual landscape I am working so hard to improve." My calm was beginning to fray at the edges. "It's not dilapidated. I inspect it every year. The bearings are greased. The tower is sound. It's an antique. People actually stop on the county road to take pictures of it." "Unacceptable," she said, making a sharp, decisive checkmark on a form on her clipboard. "This serves as your official verbal notification. You will receive a formal letter within 48 hours. You have 30 days to have the structure completely dismantled and removed from your property. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $100 per day." The sheer audacity of it left me speechless for a moment. $100 a day for a piece of my own family's history. "You can't be serious," I finally managed to say. "You can't just invent a rule and decide to tear down a landmark." "I am perfectly serious, Samuel," she said, her lips thinning into a smug line. "I am the president of this association, and I am enforcing the rules that this community agreed to live by. You will find that the HOA has considerable legal authority. I suggest you consult the bylaws. 30 days. With that, she turned on her heel, marched back to her pristine Lexus, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and my own sputtering indignation in her wake. I stood there for a long time, listening to the familiar, gentle whir of the windmill blades turning in the wind. The sound that had always been a comfort now sounded like a countdown. The war had come to my front yard. I had no idea how to fight it, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was not going to lose. That windmill wasn't going anywhere. The formal letter arrived 2 days later, just as she'd promised. It was printed on thick, cream-colored paper bearing the new, professionally designed Oak Creek Estates HOA logo, an oak leaf rendered in an unfortunate shade of sage green. The language was cold, legalistic, and absolute. It quoted the same bylaw sections she had recited to me, described my windmill as an unapproved and aesthetically discordant structure, and reiterated the threat. Remove it within 30 days or face a daily fine of $100, which could, and would, be enforced by placing a lien on my property. My first reaction was to toss it in the trash. It was absurd, a power trip by a woman with nothing better to do. But the mention of a lien gave me pause. I owned my property outright, free and clear, a legacy from my grandfather that I valued more than anything. The idea of some trumped-up HOA plastering a legal claim on my deed because of a historical landmark was not just insulting. It was a genuine threat. Still, I wasn't ready to capitulate. My first move was one of quiet defiance. I spent a weekend not dismantling the windmill, but restoring it. I wire-brushed the few spots of surface rust on the tower legs and gave them a fresh coat of galvanized paint. I climbed the tower, checked every bolt, and meticulously greased the gearbox and furling mechanism. I even polished the faded lettering on the tail vane that read "Air Motor." Then, for a little bit of what you might call malicious compliance, I went to a local trophy shop and had a small brass plaque made. I mounted it on one of the tower legs, right near the base. It read, "The Harrison Family Windmill, circa 1928, a historical feature of the Oak Creek landscape." I figured if she wanted to talk about aesthetics, I'd give her some aesthetics. This, of course, only made things worse. The 30 days passed. On day 31, the first bill arrived. HOA bylaw violation fine, $100. I wrote "void" across it in big red letters and mailed it back to the HOA's post office box. A week later, another bill came. Past due, $700. Current violation, $100. Total due, $800. I ignored that one completely. The letters kept coming, the numbers climbing at an alarming rate. It was monopoly money to me, a ridiculous fiction she was creating. But I knew that in her mind, and potentially in the eyes of some misinformed small claims court judge, this was a real debt. The conflict began to ripple out into the community. Carol's campaign for neighborhood purity was intensifying. Her next target was my neighbor 2 houses down, Mrs. Gable. She was a widow in her late 70s who lived on a modest pension. Her greatest joy was her garden. Since her husband passed, she had converted most of her front lawn into a sprawling, beautiful vegetable patch. She grew tomatoes, squash, beans, and the most amazing peppers. Most of the summer, a little cart sat at the end of her driveway with an honor box where she sold her extra produce. Carol declared Mrs. Gable's garden a violation of a rule prohibiting agricultural activity on residentially zoned lots. She sent the same kind of threatening letter, demanding Mrs. Gable tear out her garden and resod her lawn. Mrs. Gable came to me, letter in hand, tears in her eyes. "I don't know what to do, Sam," she whispered, her hands trembling. "This garden, it's all I have. I can't afford to pay fines." She said she'd put a lien on my house. Seeing her distress lit a fire under me. This wasn't just about my windmill anymore. It was about a bully terrorizing an old woman over her tomato plants. I told Mrs. Gable to sit tight and not to worry. The other neighbors were starting to get restless too. We'd talk over fences or at the local post office, a chorus of angry whispers. "Did you hear about the fine she gave the Jacksons for their basketball hoop? She told me my kid's treehouse has to be painted to match my house trim." But no one was willing to step up publicly. The threat of fines and liens was real, and Carol had made it clear she was willing to follow through. They were scared. I was getting there myself. The total on my bill had surpassed $5,000 when I received a certified letter from an attorney's office I didn't recognize. It was a formal demand for payment on behalf of the Oak Creek Estates HOA, informing me that if the debt was not settled within 15 business days, they would commence legal proceedings to place a lien on my property. The fiction was about to become a very harsh reality. My quiet defiance wasn't going to be enough. I needed a professional. That's when I called Mr. Davies. His office was in the county seat, a small, dusty suite of rooms above a hardware store. He was a man in his 60s with a fringe of white hair and a face that looked like it had seen every kind of human folly. He specialized in property law, and his online reviews mentioned more than once that he had a particular fondness for taking on overzealous HOAs. He listened to my story patiently, looking over the stack of letters and fines I'd brought with me. He examined the photo I'd taken of my new plaque on the Windmill. A slow smile spread across his face. "Mr. Harrison," he said, leaning back in his creaky chair, "you've got yourself a classic petty tyrant. These types are all the same. They get a little taste of power and it goes straight to their head. The good news is, they're usually sloppy." "Can she really put a lien on my house for this?" I asked, the question that had been keeping me up at night. "Potentially," he admitted, and my heart sank. HOA covenants can be powerful documents. If the bylaws were properly written, properly amended, and properly recorded, they can function as a contract you're bound to. However, he added, holding up a finger, that's a lot of properlies. These little dictators often get so excited about making the rules, they forget to follow the rules for making rules. He laid out a plan. The first step was to file a formal dispute, which would legally pause any lien proceedings while the matter was under review. The second step was for me to do some digging. "I want you to get me a copy of the original HOA formation documents," he said, "and any and all amendments ever filed. Go to the county recorder's office. They'll have everything on file. I also want you to get the minutes from every HOA meeting for the past 2 years. Especially the meeting where they supposedly passed this auxiliary structures rule." He also gave me another piece of advice. "Start talking to your neighbors, especially the old-timers. People who were here when the HOA was formed. Memories can be more valuable than documents sometimes." That's how I ended up on my neighbor Arthur's porch the next evening, nursing a glass of iced tea. Arthur was 85 and had lived in his house since it was built in 1960. He was a walking, talking history of the neighborhood. He was the one who told me the HOA was originally just for the gravel road because the county refused to maintain it. "This woman, Carol," Arthur said, shaking his head slowly, "she's got no respect for what this place is. It ain't a country club, it's just home." I asked him about the HOA's founding. "Oh, I remember it," he said. "Bunch of us got together in '82. We had to get the road graded. Drew up some papers. A fella named Peterson, a lawyer who lived over on the West End, he handled it all for us. Kept it real simple, just the road and the park." I asked him if he remembered anything about restrictions on existing properties. He squinted, thinking. "Peterson was real clear about that. Said we couldn't make rules about things that were already here. Grandfathered in, he called it. Said it would be a legal mess otherwise. We put it in the papers somewhere, I'm sure of it." A spark of hope ignited in my chest. Grandfathered in. The phrase echoed in my mind. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office. It was a sterile, quiet place that smelled of old paper and toner. I spent hours poring over dusty binders and scrolling through microfiche. I found the original HOA covenants from 1982. And there it was, in plain English, a clause Arthur had remembered perfectly. Article 11. "This declaration shall not be construed to apply to any structure, improvement, or land use existing upon any lot at the time of this declaration's recording." I felt a surge of triumph. The Windmill was built in 1928. The HOA was formed in 1982. They couldn't touch it. Carol's entire case was built on sand. I paid for certified copies of the documents and was about to leave when a thought occurred to me. Mr. Davies had said to get everything. I asked the clerk for the file on recent HOA amendments. She handed me a much thinner folder. Inside was the amendment for Article 4, the one Carol kept quoting. It had been filed 6 months ago. I scanned the signature page. It required the signatures of the HOA president, the secretary, and the notarized consent of at least 2/3 of the member households. Carol's signature was there as president. Her friend Brenda's was there as secretary. But underneath, instead of dozens of homeowner signatures, There was just a single, notarized affidavit. It was signed by Carol, swearing that a vote had been held at the annual meeting and that the amendment had passed with the required majority. I remembered the annual meeting. It had been held on a Tuesday night. Maybe 15 people had shown up out of nearly 80 households. I hadn't seen any vote on specific bylaw amendments. We had voted for Carol, and then she'd talked for an hour about her vision, and most of us had tuned out. It seemed impossible that she'd gotten a 2/3 majority. This felt wrong. It felt fraudulent. I packed up my copies and headed back to Mr. Davies' office, feeling like I had a shield. What I didn't know was that in that thin folder, I had also just found a sword. The foundation of Carol's authority wasn't just built on sand. It was starting to look like it was built on a deliberate lie. The turning point wasn't a single dramatic lightning strike of revelation. It was more like the slow, dawning realization that the person you're fighting isn't just a bully, but a cheat. I laid the certified copies on Mr. Davies' desk, the original 1982 covenants with the grandfather clause and the 2022 amendment with Carol's questionable affidavit. He read the grandfather clause first, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well, Mr. Harrison," he said, tapping the page, "on the matter of your windmill, this is what we call a slam dunk. It was an existing structure. They can't touch it. Her fines are illegal. Her threats are empty. We can shut this down right now with one strongly worded letter." "That's great," I said, feeling a wave of relief. "That's fantastic. But what about Mrs. Gable's garden? What about the Jacksons' basketball hoop? A letter from your office might save my windmill, but it won't stop her from terrorizing everyone else with other made-up rules." Mr. Davies leaned forward, his expression turning more serious. He picked up the copy of the amendment. "This is where it gets interesting," he said, pointing at Carol's signature on the affidavit. "She's swearing that a vote was held and that a 2/3 majority of all member households approved this change. Do you believe that happened?" "No way," I said without hesitation. "There were maybe 15 people at that meeting. We have 80 households in the association. She'd have needed at least 54 homeowners to approve it. There weren't 54 people there, let alone 54 yes votes." "Did you sign a proxy vote?" he asked. "Did she collect ballots ahead of time?" "No," I said, thinking back. "Nothing. We just voted her in as president. The rest was just her talking about beautification." Mr. Davies steepled his fingers. "Then she has a very serious problem. If she knowingly filed a false legal document with the county recorder, that's not just an HOA rules violation. That's potentially a criminal offense. Perjury, at a minimum, possibly fraud." The word criminal hung in the air. This had escalated far beyond what I'd imagined. I came here to save a windmill, and now we were talking about jail time. A part of me felt a grim satisfaction. Another part felt uneasy. But then I thought of Mrs. Gable, terrified of losing her home over a vegetable patch, and my unease vanished. Carol had made this bed. It was time for her to lie in it. "So what's our move?" I asked. "We shift from defense to offense," Mr. Davies said, a predatory glint in his eye. "A letter from me will solve your problem, but it won't solve the community's problem. The only way to do that is to remove the source of the problem, Carol Sterling. We need to expose her. The next HOA meeting is our stage." His strategy was simple and devastating. We wouldn't tip our hand. I would continue to ignore the fines, letting her believe I was just a stubborn fool. Mr. Davies would send a bland, procedural letter to the HOA's lawyer, simply stating that we disputed the validity of the fines and requested mediation, a standard tactic to stall for time. Meanwhile, I had homework. "I need proof," Mr. Davies instructed. "Get me a list of every person who was at that annual meeting. Get them to sign a statement saying they were there and that no vote on bylaw amendments took place. The more signatures, the better. And while you're at it," he added, "it might be time to look at the HOA's finances. Bullies who lie about votes often lie about money too." This was the real beginning of the investigation. I started with Arthur, who had been at the meeting. He signed my statement without a second thought. "She never called a vote on no rules," he grumbled, "just on herself." From there, Arthur and I became a quiet team of insurrectionists. We went door to door, but only to the people we knew had been at the meeting. We didn't want to alert Carol that something was afoot. We collected 12 signatures in total, a dozen people willing to state on paper that Carol's affidavit was a lie. The finances were a tougher nut to crack. As a homeowner, I had the right to review the books, but I had to make a formal request. I sent a certified letter to the HOA, CCing Mr. Davies, requesting a copy of the complete financial statements for the past 2 years. The response I got was a single-page summary, a laughably vague document that listed large, round numbers next to categories like administrative expenses, landscaping, and legal consultation. It told me nothing. This was another of Carol's mistakes. Obstructing a homeowner's legitimate request for financial records was a major violation of the state's HOA laws. Mr. Davies fired off another letter, this one far less pleasant, threatening legal action if the detailed records, including all invoices and receipts, were not provided within 10 business days. While we waited, I decided to do some public record digging of my own. The vague summary had listed a company called Sterling Management Solutions, LLC, as the recipient of tens of thousands of dollars in administrative and consulting fees. The name was a little too on the nose. I went to the state's Secretary of State website and looked up the LLC. It had been formed just 1 month after Carol became president. The registered agent and sole officer listed was a man named Robert Sterling. A quick search on social media confirmed my suspicion. Robert Sterling was Carol's husband. She wasn't just a bully and a liar, she was a thief. She was using her position as HOA president to funnel our dues directly into her own family's pockets. She was paying her husband's sham company for consulting on the very rules she was ramming down our throats. The $100 a day fine for my windmill wasn't just about power. It was about funding her own grift. Every fine she levied, every threat she made, was part of a scheme to enrich herself. I printed out the LLC registration and the financial summary. I had the signed statements from the meeting attendees. I had the certified copy of the original covenants with the grandfather clause. I had a complete, interlocking case of malfeasance, fraud, and self-dealing. My little dispute over a rusty windmill had unearthed the rot that went to the very core of our community's leadership. Mr. Davies was ecstatic. "This is it," he said, spreading the documents across his desk like a winning hand of poker. "This is everything we need. The meeting is next Tuesday. Are you ready, Mr. Harrison? It's time to give the people a show." The night of the HOA meeting, the community center's small meeting room was buzzing. Word had spread. My quiet canvassing with Arthur had turned into a neighborhood-wide whisper network. People who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in a decade were there. Mrs. Gable was in the front row, flanked by her 2 grown sons. The Jacksons, of basketball hoop fame, were there. The family with the non-compliant treehouse was there. The room was packed, with people standing along the back wall. The air was thick with anticipation and resentment. We had over 60 households represented, a historic turnout. Carol Sterling arrived with her secretary Brenda and took her place at the front table, looking flustered by the crowd. She clearly expected another sleepy meeting with a handful of attendees she could easily control. Seeing the sea of hostile faces, her usual smug confidence was replaced by a flicker of anxiety. She gripped her gavel and banged it sharply on the table. "This meeting of the Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association will now come to order," she announced, her voice a little too loud. She tried to proceed with her standard agenda, reading the minutes from the last meeting, but the crowd was restless. "Point of order," a voice called out from the back. It was Bill Jackson. "We have new business that needs to be addressed immediately." Carol's face tightened. "All new business must be submitted in writing prior to the meeting. We will follow the established agenda." "I think we'll make an exception tonight," I said, standing up from my seat in the second row. All eyes turned to me. I was holding a manila folder. "I have a presentation for the community regarding the conduct of our president." "You are out of order, Samuel," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Sit down. If you do not sit down, I will have you removed." "Removed by who, Carol?" I asked calmly. "There's no one here to do it." And I think these people, I said, gesturing to the packed room, want to hear what I have to say. A chorus of "let him speak" and "yeah, hear him out" rose from the crowd. Her face went pale. The gavel in her hand trembled. She had completely lost control of the room. I walked to the front and stood beside the table, facing the community. I opened my folder. "My neighbors," I began, my voice steady. "I'm here because our HOA president, Carol Sterling, tried to fine me for my family's windmill. She claimed it was an unauthorized structure. She's currently billing me over $9,000 and has threatened to put a lien on my home." A wave of murmurs swept through the room. "What she failed to realize," I continued, holding up a certified document, "is that the founding covenants of this HOA from 1982 contain a grandfather clause. Article 11. It explicitly states that the HOA has no authority over any structure that existed before the HOA was formed. My windmill was built in 1928. Her fines are illegal. Her threats are baseless." I placed the document on the table in front of her. She stared at it as if it were a snake. "This is just the beginning," I said, my voice growing stronger. "President Sterling has been enforcing a whole host of new rules, from what kind of mailboxes we can have to whether an old woman can grow tomatoes in her own yard." I looked at Mrs. Gable, who gave me a small, determined nod. "She claims these rules were approved by a 2/3 majority of the homeowners, as required by our bylaws. She even filed a notarized affidavit with the county swearing that such a vote took place." I then held up another sheaf of papers. "These are signed statements from 12 residents who were at that annual meeting. All of them swear that no such vote ever happened. Carol Sterling did not get our permission. She lied. She filed a false legal document to give herself the power to harass us." The room erupted. "Liar!" someone shouted. "Fraud!" yelled another. Carol was shrinking in her chair, her face a mask of disbelief and rage. Her friend Brenda looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. "But why?" I asked the crowd, letting the noise die down. "Why go to all this trouble? Why invent rules and lie to get them passed?" I think I found the answer. I held up the last two documents, the HOA's vague financial summary and the state registration for Sterling Management Solutions, LLC. This is the financial report our president provided. It shows tens of thousands of dollars paid to a company for administrative services. And this, I said, holding up the other paper, shows that this company is owned by her husband, Robert Sterling. She has been using our dues, the money we pay for road maintenance and park mowing, to pay her own family. The more rules she creates, the more consulting her husband can bill us for. The more fines she collects, the more money goes into the pot she's skimming from. This isn't about property values. It's about theft. The revelation landed like a physical blow. The room fell silent for a heartbeat, and then exploded into pure pandemonium. People were on their feet, shouting at the front table. "Thief! Embezzler! Give us our money back!" Carol finally snapped. "Lies! All lies!" she screamed, scrambling to her feet, her face contorted with fury. "You have no proof. This is slander. I'll sue every one of you." Mr. Davies, who had been standing quietly at the back of the room, chose that moment to step forward. "I wouldn't recommend that, Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice cutting through the din. "I'm Samuel Harrison's legal counsel. Every document he has presented is a certified public record, and filing a false affidavit with the county, as well as the clear self-dealing and embezzlement of HOA funds, are criminal offenses. I've already taken the liberty of forwarding this entire file to the district attorney's office." That was the final nail. The fight went out of Carol completely. Her face crumpled, the rage replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. She looked wildly around the room, at the faces of the neighbors she had tormented, and saw no sympathy, only cold, hard judgment. With a choked sob, she grabbed her purse, shoved her way past a stunned Brenda, and fled out the back door of the community center into the night. In the stunned silence that followed her exit, Arthur stood up. "I move for a vote of no confidence in the entire current board," he said, his old voice ringing with authority. "And I move that we freeze all HOA accounts and authorize a full independent forensic audit, effective immediately. Hands shot up all over the room. It was unanimous. The reign of Carol Sterling was over. The aftermath of that explosive meeting was swift and decisive. The remaining board members, including a very shaken Brenda, tendered their resignations via email the next morning. An emergency interim board was formed, with Arthur reluctantly agreeing to serve as president. His first official act was to hire an independent accounting firm to conduct the forensic audit Mr. Davies had called for. The auditors descended on the HOA's haphazard records and, within a week, confirmed everything I had uncovered and more. Carol had been funneling money to her husband's shell company from day one. The consulting invoices were for ludicrously vague services like community standards analysis and bylaw modernization strategy, often billed at hundreds of dollars an hour. She had also used the HOA debit card for personal expenses, including lavish dinners, online shopping, and even a spa weekend, which she'd laughably categorized as board wellness and retreat. The total amount of embezzled and misappropriated funds came to just over $47,000. As Mr. Davies had predicted, the district attorney's office took the case very seriously. Armed with the audit and the sworn statements about the fraudulent bylaw amendment, they filed multiple felony charges against Carol Sterling, including grand larceny, embezzlement, and perjury. Her husband was also charged as a co-conspirator. The news spread through the county like wildfire. The story of the corrupt HOA president taken down by a man defending his historic windmill became something of a local legend. Carol's trial was short. The evidence was so overwhelming that her lawyer advised her to take a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to the embezzlement charge in exchange for the others being dropped. The judge was not lenient. He sentenced her to 5 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and, most importantly, ordered her to pay full restitution to the Oak Creek Estates HOA in the amount of $47,281.56. They were forced to sell their pearl-white Lexus and take out a second mortgage on their beige stucco box to pay it back. Their financial ruin was as complete as their social ruin. My own vindication was quiet but deeply satisfying. The new interim board passed a resolution at their first meeting. It officially recognized the historical status of my windmill, nullified all fines against me and every other resident levied under Carol's illegal bylaws, and issued a formal, public apology to me, Mrs. Gable, and all the other families who had been harassed. The lien threat vanished as if it had never existed. My property was safe, my name was cleared. More than that, I was no longer just Sam the mechanic. In the eyes of my neighbors, I was the guy who had stood up to the bully and won. People would wave as they drove past my shop or stop by just to thank me. It was an odd feeling, being a hero. It wasn't a role I had ever sought, but I wore it with a quiet pride. The community itself began to heal and reform. Under Arthur's steady guidance, we held a series of open meetings to rewrite the HOA's governing documents from the ground up. This time, the entire neighborhood was involved. We kept the language simple, the rules reasonable, and the powers of the board strictly limited. The dues were lowered back to a sensible amount, just enough to cover the road grading and park maintenance. We put in place ironclad transparency rules for all financial matters, requiring dual signatures on all checks and the posting of detailed monthly expense reports on a community website. The infamous rulebook of Carol Sterling was ceremoniously shredded. Mrs. Gable's garden was safe. The Jacksons' basketball hoop was back up. The neighborhood felt like itself again, only better. The shared experience of fighting off a tyrant had forged a new sense of unity among us. We weren't just a collection of houses anymore. We were a community that had fought for its own soul and won. We started having neighborhood potlucks in the park, something we hadn't done in years. The petunias we planted in the community flower bed that summer seemed brighter than ever. A couple of years passed. The beige stucco box at the end of the road finally sold. The Sterlings had moved away in the middle of the night shortly after the sentencing, unable to bear the shame and the cold shoulders of the community they had tried to dominate. A nice young family with 2 kids moved in, and the first thing they did was paint the house a pleasant shade of blue and put up a swing set in the backyard. It looked like a home. Life in Oak Creek Estates returned to a peaceful, comfortable rhythm. Arthur served as HOA president for 1 year, as promised, before handing the reins over to a retired schoolteacher who managed the association's simple duties with quiet competence and common sense. The HOA became what it was always meant to be, a boring but useful utility, not a weapon. Property values, which Carol had been so obsessed with, actually began to climb, not because of uniform mailboxes, but because our neighborhood had earned a reputation as a friendly, well-managed, and tight-knit community. I saw Carol Sterling one last time, about a year after she moved away. I was in a discount grocery store in a town about 30 miles away, picking up some bulk cleaning supplies for the shop. I turned a corner into the canned goods aisle, and there she was. She looked diminished. The expensive pantsuit was gone, replaced by a faded floral blouse and ill-fitting jeans. Her hair wasn't perfectly coiffed. She looked tired and worn down, just another anonymous shopper trying to find a deal on green beans. Our eyes met for a brief second, a flicker of recognition, followed by a wave of shame that washed over her face. She quickly looked down at her shopping cart, her shoulders slumping. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The arrogant, powerful woman who had threatened my home and terrorized my neighbors was gone, replaced by this defeated, pathetic figure. I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel the triumphant satisfaction I had expected. I just felt a strange, detached pity. She had been the architect of her own destruction, brought down by her own greed and arrogance. Without a word, I turned my own cart around and walked away, leaving her alone in the aisle. Justice had been served, and there was nothing more to say. Looking back on it all now, the whole affair seems both absurd and profoundly important. It started with a woman who confused rules with righteousness and control with community. She saw a piece of history and called it junk, saw a neighbor's joy and called it a violation. She believed that power gave her the right to impose her will on others, and she learned the hard way that a community's true strength isn't in its bylaws, but in the willingness of its people to stand up for each other. Tyrants, big and small, thrive on apathy. They count on good people being too busy or too intimidated to fight back. Our story was a small-scale lesson in a timeless truth. When people find their collective voice, even the most entrenched bully doesn't stand a chance. My life is back to normal now, and for that, I am profoundly grateful. I spend my days in the workshop, the smell of grease and gasoline my constant companion. Customers come and go. I fix their lawnmowers, their generators, their chainsaws. I solve problems with wrenches and patience. It's a good, honest living. I'm just Sam the mechanic again, a man who prefers the company of machines to the complexities of politics. And every now and then, when I'm walking from the house to the shop, I'll stop and look up at the old windmill. It stands tall and proud against the sky, a silent sentinel watching over our peaceful neighborhood. The wind catches its blades, and they turn with that same familiar rhythmic whir. It's more than just a landmark to me now. It's a reminder that some things are worth fighting for, that history has value, and that sometimes the most reasonable thing a man can do is refuse to bend to an unreasonable world.